All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. I think folks are still filing in, but as they do, I'm just going to start with a quick orientation to the Zoom functionality on this webinar so you can best navigate the tools here. And after that, I'm going to go briefly into introductions to the speakers and the flow of the workshop. My colleague Megan Fowler is your tech support today, so please send her a private chat if you're having any technical issues or if you need any further direct support throughout the call. In the top right corner, you can choose either speaker or gallery view. For the main presentation, we suggest that you be in speaker view, and you'll be able to scroll through thumbnail images of other participants who are here on the call with us. And for the breakout groups a little bit later, the gallery view is a nice way to see everyone in your smaller group on one screen. We're keeping everybody muted for the main presentation, but you'll have the opportunity to chat more during the breakout groups. We encourage everyone to turn on their video for networking purposes if you're comfortable with that, but you do not have to, of course. And the participants button allows you to view a list of the other participants on the call. The chat button there, the one that looks like a little thought bubble, that one's really important. The moderators will be sharing links and information with the group in the chat throughout the presentation. So if you just click on that icon, a sidebar will pop up, and you can use the chat box to pose any questions or comments that you have throughout the presentation. We'll do our best to get to everyone's questions during the Q&A section of the agenda. And if you notice the drop down there, it allows you to chat with either everybody on the call or privately to an individual. The main presentation is being recorded, and we'll make it available on AFT's website along with a resource handout with resources that will be mentioned by today's speakers. The breakout groups later will not be recorded. Today, we're also going to be running a few polls to gauge where you as the audience are at and keep you all on your toes. So we'll start with the first one now. Just take a minute to fill out the poll so we can get a sense of who is in the room. And as you're filling out that poll, I just wanted to extend a formal welcome to the second webinar of the Farms for the Future project, Strategies and Tools for Farm Protection. My name is Jamie Pottern, and I'm the New England Program Manager at American Farmland Trust, and I will be your MC for the next 90 minutes. So we're just gonna turn my attention over here to the poll for a second. Let's see. All right. So it looks like can you all see the poll? Yeah, so it looks like 75% of you are land trust volunteer or staff, which is great. About a quarter of you are municipal volunteers or staff, and a few other. So that's really great to know who's here. This is really our intended audience for these webinars was land trust and municipal folks. So good job, Jeremy, in your outreach. So that's great to know, great mix of folks. So a little bit more about the workshop series really quick before we dig into it. This series was created through the partnership and real incredible efforts of the following people and organizations. My colleague Megan Fowler and myself at American Farmland Trust, Stephanie Morningstar at the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust, Meg Quinn at Maine Farmland Trust, Jeremy Lugee at Southeast Land Trust of New Hampshire, and Nancy Everhart at the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. And this project has been generously funded by Jane's Trust. So we are joined today by some really wonderful guest speakers, some true champions in the field of agriculture and land protection in our region. Adam Bishop, Maine Farmland Trust Farmland Protection Program Director, Steph Morningstar, who's the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust's Executive Director, there she is. Stephanie Lugee is the Conservation Project Manager and Farmland Coordinator at the Southeast Land Trust of New Hampshire. So powerhouse team, we're so psyched to have them with us. So this webinar is the second in a 5-part series of educational workshops that we have designed specifically, as I said, for land trust, municipalities, and other nonprofits and service providers in New Hampshire and the other northern New England states who would like to better understand how to support farms and farmers in their communities. And especially due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and I'm sure you've all seen this in your communities, there's just a growing interest in local agriculture and a real desire for more skills and training for securing a more resilient food system at the local level and advancing greater land justice. Therefore, each workshop has been crafted to offer core content, state-specific tools, resources, question and answer session, and some networking opportunities. Each workshop also builds off of the previous one, and we really encourage you to try to attend as many of these as possible, and even to go back and catch up on the recordings of any you may have missed, which will be available on our website. So last week's workshop offered a broad overview of the principles and tools for developing more farm-friendly communities. Today's we'll dig into tools for farm protection. Next week, you'll have the opportunity to tune in and learn about solar siting in farmland, followed by strategies and tools for making farmland available to farmers. And the last webinar will be tools and resources for supporting Black, Indigenous, and farmers of color in your community. And we'll go over the dates of these and other upcoming workshops at the end of this presentation. So really quickly, as we navigate the topic of land policy and land justice in this learning space together, we just want to invite you to all be inquisitive while being open to others' perspectives and worldviews. We encourage you to be as present as possible in listening and engaging during these 90 minutes. We know you're on a lot of Zoom calls these days, but we also want you to be comfortable. So make sure, get up if you need to get a cup of coffee or tea, use the restroom, whatever you need to do that helps you focus. And our hope is that through listening and learning in this space, that we'll all leave today with a commitment to continued learning and hopefully taking some concrete actions to advance this critical work in our communities. So the agenda real quick, you'll hear first today from Adam Bishop. He's going to be sharing in a pre-recorded content, his extensive knowledge on tools that can be used for protecting farmland in communities. Beth Morningstar will then give an overview of the work of Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust in advancing land sovereignty for Black, Indigenous, and farmers of color, and also what makes NEFO really unique as a land trust. Becoming more educated about land justice is vital to our work collectively in protecting land. And so our planning team and our speakers will be weaving this topic and farmer voices into the workshops that follow in the series. Emi Luigi will then provide an overview of some of the on-the-ground farmland protection work happening in New Hampshire and examples of tools and partnerships that you can learn from to go back to your own communities and use. We'll then have a Q&A with all the speakers, followed by a short breakout group activity. Quick report back from the facilitators before we try to wrap it up by 3:30. So we've got a great suite of activities for you today. And without further ado, we're going to launch a video from Maine Farmland Trust's Adam Bishop about the nuts and bolts of farmland protection. So take it away, Megan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending this presentation. My name is Adam Bishop. I am the director of the Farmland Protection Department at Maine Farmland Trust. We are a statewide land trust in Maine with the mission to protect farmland, support farmers, and advance the future of farming in Maine. I've been asked to sort of take part in this today to give a summary or sort of a high-level overview of what it means when we talk about farmland protection or protecting farmland, here in Maine and in New Hampshire, Vermont, all the northern New England areas that are involved with this workshop. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to talk about sort of the nuts and bolts of farmland conservation. But before I do that, I just want to take a step back for a minute and give an overview of a very short overview of some of the challenges that are facing farming and agriculture in our states. Essentially, we're going to talk about farmland protection, but why do we need to protect farmland? If there was no threat to farmland, we wouldn't have to do the kind of work that we're talking about today. So basically, what is the threat? What are we protecting farmland from? Essentially, we at MFT and other land trusts like MFT have as a goal to protect farmland and to keep farms, farmland, and agricultural land from transitioning out of agricultural use or the ability to be used for farming or some kind of agriculture. And, what does that look like? I think we all sort of have the basic idea. We're talking about protecting farmland from development. So that could look like what people typically think of, a big residential subdevelopment that sprouts up on what used to be productive farm fields. It could look a little different than that. It could look like large lot development. We're not talking 30 or 40 houses, but maybe we're talking 2 or 3 sort of kingdom lots that divide up a farm into non-farmable properties. It could look like solar development. More and more, that's the case here in Maine, and it has been the case in other states in New England. And we're gonna talk on that a little bit later and a little bit more deeply in another one of these presentations. Or it could just look like transition of a property from a farmer to a non-farmer who's not really developing it or dividing it, but just taking it out of use as an agricultural property. So all those things are what organizations like Maine Farmland Trust and other land trusts are talking about when we talk about farmland protection or protecting farming. We're trying to stop those scenarios. And when is it most likely that, when's the danger point really is sort of one thing that we often think about. And the real danger point is when a property is transitioning in ownership. So it's either transitioning in ownership within a family from generation to generation, or it's transferring, from owner to owner outside of a family. But anytime a property is undergoing that kind of transition in ownership is when it's the most vulnerable to move from farmland or active farming status out of agricultural use entirely into some kind of non-agricultural development. So what our organization and other organizations are trying to do is step in and make sure that when those transitions happen, there is something that is protecting the farm from being taken out of agricultural use and changed into some sort of developed property. So that's the threat, and I'm sure all of you, some of you have witnessed this in your own communities and in your own states. Farms that were productive at one time now not being productive, maybe being productive in terms of growing houses or solar panels or something like that. Next, we're going to move into that's what it means when we talk about farmland protection, or that's what we're trying to protect farms from. What does it mean when we say farmland protection? So, and what are some basic tools that are typically used to protect farms? So when we say farmland protection, what we're talking about in this context is legally protecting or legally using a legal tool to prevent someone from having the right to develop a property, generally speaking. There's lots of tools that land trusts use to protect properties and to protect farms. For example, a land trust could buy a farm and own it and intend on owning it for a long period of time and not developing it and leasing it to farmers. And that's a model that's out there, and that's a model that works. But by and large, the majority, the vast majority of farmland conservation in New England and in the United States is done through the use of a tool called a conservation easement. A conservation easement is a legal document that essentially places a certain set of restrictions on what a landowner can or can't do on their property. It's a document that gets recorded in the registry of deeds or in the land records of any particular state. It lasts forever, and essentially when a landowner agrees to encumber their property with a conservation easement, they're giving up certain rights of development that they may have prior to the conservation easement. So we in the land trust community, I as a representative of MFT, meet with a lot of landowners all the time and try to talk them through the concept of a conservation easement, which is a really complex document. The ones that MFT uses generally run about 25, 27 pages long, And that's a real lot for anybody to digest when you're trying to give a 30,000-foot summary of what's going on with a conservation easement. But I try to hit on 4 main ideas. When you protect a property with a conservation easement, or let me step back to say, there's a lot of different kinds of conservation easements out there. And there's a lot of different kinds of land trusts out there. So there's land trusts and conservation easements where the goal is to protect a property from ever being developed in any way and keep it in a completely natural state. Not allow anything to happen there, essentially protect it as wilderness. The types of conservation easements that we're talking about today that MFT uses, or other agricultural focused land trusts in other states, generally we refer to them as agricultural conservation easements. And these are sort of the exact opposite of an easement that is requiring everything to sort of stay as is. We want them to be as flexible as possible to allow for a landowner to do what they need to do on their property and have it be a viable farm while sort of taking away the possibility for non-agricultural development. So the 4 main ideas that I generally tend to hit on are, number 1, the conservation easement, an agricultural conservation easement, is going to limit the ability of a property to be divided in the future. Perhaps eliminate the possibility of it to be divided, or maybe allow for limited division, such as into 2 farms instead of 1 farm, but generally prohibit the kind of division that would lead to residential or commercial development. The second main idea is the land trust works with the farmer to designate certain parts of the property where buildings, agricultural buildings, are permitted to exist, to be developed, to be enlarged, to be replaced, and as much as possible to site those buildings in such a way that we're not taking away from the farm's viability by, say, plopping them right in the middle of all the best fields. The third main idea is that the property's fields are required to be kept open as fields. It takes a lot of work to turn woodland into productive farm fields, and the existence of those fields is part of what we're trying to protect through the conservation easement. So the easement is going to prohibit or going to require the landowner to keep the fields maintained as fields, either through mowing, haying, grazing, cultivating, any of those sorts of practices. And the fourth main idea that's important to hit on, especially here in New England, where lots of our farms have a significant woodlot component, is that there are some restrictions placed on the types of forestry that can happen on the property. And essentially, we want forestry to be conducted in a sustainable way that doesn't have a negative impact on the property's value as an agricultural piece of land. So that's the tool we're talking about here, the conservation easement. What it does is prohibit non-agricultural development while allowing for enough flexibility for the property to remain viable as a farm. The next part of this is, why would any landowner want to do this? Why would any landowner want to give up the rights that they have on their farm to develop it in any way that they desire, and, deal with a land trust that, part of doing a conservation easement is the land trust has the requirement to oversee what's going on at the farm and make sure the landowner is abiding by the restrictions of the conservation easement. Additionally, if the landowner is not abiding by the restrictions of the conservation easement, the land trust has to take action to bring the property back into compliance. So that's just to say that these things have teeth. They're real restrictions. There's no ignoring them. They last forever. And they've held up in court time after time. So why would a landowner want to enter into this type of relationship? Well, the first thing is to sort of look at it in an altruistic way and just say there's landowners out there that want to protect their property as a farm forever, want to have some assurance that after they're gone from the property, the farm is going to remain It's not going to be developed by their children or by the next landowner. And they enter into these agreements sort of out of goodwill. And that's how a lot of farmland conservation in New England has been done. And what that's called is donating the conservation easement. A landowner agrees to restrict the property in this way, and they don't receive anything for it in terms of compensation. So here it's sort of important to stop and sort of examine something, because what does it mean in terms of what does it mean when we say a conservation easement has value? You think about a property, say a property that's worth $400,000. It's a big farm, it's got infrastructure, and that's sort of what the fair market value would be. Then you encumber it with a conservation easement, or you put these restrictions on the property that say you can't divide it, you can't develop it, you can only build in these areas, and so on. It's probably not worth $400,000 anymore. Now it comes with all these restrictions, as well as the land trust, whose responsibility is to enforce the restrictions. And say, in this case, that $400,000 property is now only worth $300,000. The difference between the value of the property as unencumbered by any restrictions and the value of it with the restrictions in place, in this case, is the difference between $400,000 and $300,000. That difference is the value of the conservation easement, or $100,000. We were talking about how people decide. We've done a lot of donated conservation easements. And in that case, you're making a donation of the easement to a land trust, and you are giving them something of value, the conservation easement. If you're giving that away without being compensated for it, you can get some tax benefits. It's the same as if you give money to any nonprofit. You're giving a donation, and you can realize some income tax benefits. But more and more in Maine, and I know in other states in New England as well, the vast majority of our agricultural land protection work is done now through the purchase of conservation easements. So that is when a land trust enters into a deal with a farmer or landowner and says, we are going to pay you X amount of dollars. In exchange, you will sell us the conservation easement on the property. We will receive the easement and be responsible for holding it and enforcing it over time. And in exchange for that, the landowner gets compensated a certain amount of money, which in the case of farming works out especially well, because as we all know, farming oftentimes happens on really thin margins, and a big influx of capital can be really useful to invest in the farm, to invest in animals or equipment, pay down debt, perhaps purchase additional land, perhaps get some equity out of the property that allows a landowner to retire and pass the farm on to their children instead of selling it on the open real estate market. So much of the land protection work that we do in terms of farmland protection happens through this type of compensation for the sale of a conservation easement. So we sort of think about that as, how do we get from point A to point B? The unprotected property to a protected farm. And sort of in summary, it can happen through a donation or it can happen through a purchase. Easements have value, and that's why land trusts oftentimes can compensate or pay landowners for the conservation easement. So sort of the next section of this is, how does that work? Where does the money come from? And it's different in every state. Every state has a different source of funding, and I'm going to touch on those a little bit, a different level of funding. But the money can be essentially private philanthropic capital, donations that are raised from the community or from members to fund this type of work. or it can be done with public money. That's through federal or state grant programs that exist to provide funding for this type of agricultural conservation work, or it can be done through a combination of both of those things. So one thing that all the states that are participating in this series of webinars have in common is that we all use federal funding in some way, shape, or form to help pay for conservation easements on farmland. And that is accomplished through NRCS, or the Natural Resource Conservation Service. That's a division of the United States Department of Agriculture, through their agricultural land easement program. Additionally, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont all have state-specific sources of funding that can be channeled toward this type of agricultural land protection. So, and finally, at least in Maine, sometimes there are municipal sources of funding that can come from the town level to go into this pot that allows for a land trust to purchase the easement from a farmer. So, what motivates people to do this? It's goodwill, it's good intentions, it's money, like a lot of other things in the world. And that's how we get a lot of the conservation work done that we've gotten done to this date.
Great. So thanks so much to Adam for sharing so much of his incredible knowledge, rocking the backwards baseball cap there. As I mentioned earlier, he's not able to be live on the call himself today, but we were very lucky to get his thoughts on some high-level tools and things to think about when we're talking about conserving farmland. So next, let's run a quick poll. We just want to gauge the type of farm protection and land access work that you all here on the call have some experience with in your communities. So just take a quick minute to fill that out. Let's see. Okay, so just sharing the results here. This is not surprising, but really exciting to see that most of you here on the call, the vast majority, have protected a farm with a conservation easement, which is really great. And some of you have been delving, about a third of you have been delving into providing access to land for a farmer for sale or lease. Some of those projects, it seems, have addressed affordability and equity, which is really great. And some of you are even thinking about how to provide access to land for beginning, new entry, or Black, Indigenous, and farmers of color. And some of you have undertaken some regenerative practices. So that's really, really great to hear. And that tees us up nicely for the next speaker that I'm excited to introduce. We're gonna now launch a short presentation from my friend and colleague, Stephanie Morningstar, who's gonna talk a little bit about the work of the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust and really what sets them apart from other land trusts and some of the work that they're doing here in our region.
Hi everybody, it's Stephanie Morningstar, Executive Director of the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust. We're here today to give you a brief overview of our organization, what sets us apart from other land trusts, and how we're working together in a collaborative way to build a racially just and regenerative regional food system in the Northeast. The Northeast Farmers of Color Network basically created the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust. So you're seeing here some folks from our August 2019 Skillshare gathering. The Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust started its work advancing land access for BIPOC farmers in January 2019, emerging from the Northeast Farmers of Color Network. The Northeast Farmers of Color Network is an informal alliance of Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and Asian farmers making our lives on land in New England and upstate New York. There are 21 founding member farms who began the NEFOC network, and the members have grown to over 350 as of today's date. The NEFOC network was built to serve three purposes. First, to break the isolation of being a farmer of color in the Northeast by building relationships of mutual respect and joy, the foundation of all other movement work. Second, we're built to share skills, resources, and time with one another through mutual aid. to build collaborative projects and initiatives. One of the things that we've done recently is we built a BIPOC Farmers COVID Skillshare series that emerged during the COVID pandemic. The third is to coordinate our policy demands and to catalyze reparations for Black, Indigenous, POC farmers and land stewards. The NEFOC network identified that the number one barrier to feeding our communities healthy, fresh food is access to land. The NEFOC Land Trust was envisioned by the NEFOC network members, served the will of the network members as a direct response to this barrier, and secured funding to hire a coordinator to manifest a land trust. The NEFOC Land Trust is distinct in that it is a separate entity working to pave the way for equitable land access for BIPOC farmers, land stewards, and earthworkers in the Northeast region. The NEFOC Land Trust will continue to serve the NEFOC network members who will directly benefit from the land access work we're doing and building in the Northeast region as well as nationally. Our vision as a land trust is to advance land sovereignty in the Northeast region through permanent and secure land tenure for Indigenous, Black, Latinx, and Asian farmers and land stewards who will use the land in a sacred manner that honors our ancestors' dreams for sustainable farming, human habitat, ceremony, native ecosystem restoration, and cultural preservation. We're unique for quite a few reasons, but the first would be our for us, by us, and nothing about us without us sort of foundation. So everything that we do is led by and for Indigenous, Black, Latinx, and Asian BIPOC folks. We have an interesting hybrid model that we share, which is the development of a community land trust as well as a conservation land trust. That focuses on the development of farmland preservation, Black land loss, Indigenous land theft. We're creating common spaces and allowing for permanent, secure, and inheritable land tenure and cooperative business models. The Conservation Land Trust enables conservation and restoration of native species ecosystems, culturally significant lands held in a sacred and culturally congruent manner, and we are advancing personhood goals and policy. All of these two things combined, this hybrid model, are meant to basically affect health, wealth, and joy. So we're looking at building healthy, permanently accessible land, healthy communities, growing our own foods and medicines, a joyful honoring of our cultural lifeways, native species ecosystems in balance, a new economic system that reclaims, builds, and shares wealth. We're looking at drawing down carbon, building thriving soil, and creation of respecting creation or respecting nature as a living being. So some of our unique approach is that we're really deeply rooted in systems change and emergent strategy. Everything that we do is based on taking a look at where is the root cause. So a lot of the root cause of the lack of land access for us certainly comes to forward is systemic racism. We are, again, BIPOC specific. We're also 100% BIPOC led. We have a deep relationship with building relationship with Indigenous communities through our Indigenous consultation process. Again, we're a hybrid land trust that is building common spaces as well as incorporating conservation practices. We really found a lot of the work that we do on land-based wealth redistribution. We're also trying to create a carbon drawdown in the Northeast through our land holdings, and we really appreciate and draw on the vision of decentralized leadership within this structure. So really looking at global Indigenous approaches to leadership and governance.
So thanks so much, Steph, for that video. Steph will be providing a much more detailed historical context and more specifics about the work of NEFOC Land Trust, how to support their efforts in the region in workshops 4 and 5 coming up soon. So we hope you register for those. She is also here on the call with us today, and she'll be available for any questions during the Q&A coming up in just a bit. But now I'd like to hand it off to Jeremy Luigi from Southeast Land Trust, who's going to build off of Adam's presentation earlier, and we'll dig into some of the New Hampshire specific tools, resources, and examples of farmland protection efforts. Jeremy pre-recorded his talk, but he's also here live on the call for the Q&A that will follow. And you can wave for us, Jeremy, so people know there you are, there he is. All right, so take it away, Megan.
Hi. My name is Jeremy Luigi, and I work for the Southeast Land Trust of New Hampshire as a conservation project manager and farmland coordinator. SELT's mission is to protect and sustain the significant lands in our community for clean water, outdoor recreation, fresh food, wildlife, and healthy forests. Conserving farmland is one of our primary focus areas, and we usually protect about 2 to 3 farms a year. As Adam mentioned earlier, we use a variety of strategies to protect farmland, and I'll get into those details in a minute. But first, I'd like to talk a little bit about why we feel it's so important to protect farms and farmland in New Hampshire. So here's the underlying question. Where are we going to get our food in the next 50 years? As a state, we've lost nearly 90% of our farmland since 1925. And in that same century, our population nearly quadrupled. Today, our farms only produce about 5 to 10% of the food we consume. So what does that really mean from a food security and sustainability perspective? In other words, what happens if the food supply runs dry? Well, recently a group of citizens got together to ask that very question, and what came out of it was the New England Food Vision. Their goal is to see New England stretch our regional farm and food system capacity to produce up to 50% of our food needs by 2060. I think people landed on such a bold goal because it's crazy to think about what could happen if there was ever a break in our food supply. Currently, our food travels an average of 1,500 miles to reach us, and there are lots of situations that could disrupt that flow. I think we got just a small taste of that with the grocery store shortages earlier this year at the start of COVID. It was a really helpless feeling to be in, but it seems as though more people are now switching to local farms for more of their diet because it can be a healthy, dependable, and secure way to eat. This change in people's habits provides a direct infusion into our local economy, and it also helps to sustain all the other benefits farms bring to our communities, like water supply protection, wildlife habitat, scenic views, and a continuation of that rural character New Hampshire depends on to support its tourism-based economy. New Hampshire's food system contributes roughly $3.2 billion in gross state product, or about 5.7% of New Hampshire's $58 billion a year economy. Imagine if more of that food were produced and sold locally, and those billions of dollars stayed in New Hampshire to circulate around our local economies. Also, just to dispel a misconception, land trusts and other conservation groups are not against development and growth. After all, we all need secure housing. In fact, it's one of our most important needs. However, we also want that growth to be done in a smart way, taking into account our other survival needs, like eating, which is also pretty darn important, as well as having access to a healthy, safe, and secure food supply, even during a worst-case scenario like a pandemic. To add to those reasons, of course, with New Hampshire being the land of no income tax, we also rely heavily on property taxes to pay for our community services like schools, police, fire departments, city water, sewer, and other public works. It's really enticing to believe that more houses will equal more tax revenues and lower taxes. However, that argument was already debunked long ago with studies done by economists and University Extension staff. In this case, in Londonderry, they took a real-life scenario to show just how much more expensive a 240-lot housing subdivision was when compared to leaving it in farmland. After the annual property taxes were paid, they showed it would be the cost of an additional $643,000 annually to provide services to those houses between the added students at the school, the cost of police, fire, sewer, all of those expenses compared to a net revenue of about $18,000 a year from the farm. The question is, what would you like your community to look like? Most recently, the American Farmland Trust released a new report looking how to prioritize farmland protection work. In the 15 years between 2001 and 2016, New Hampshire lost more than 11,600 acres to farmland. They also found that prime farmland, the best and most productive soil to grow food on, was also the most likely to be developed. That same amount of farmland can produce about $5.1 million worth of food per year. Interestingly, they also found that out of the 11,600 acres of land lost to development, a little less than half was lost to urban, highly developed land uses, whereas more than half of that farmland was being lost to low-density residential development. And you can see this all across our rural landscapes where fields start sprouting houses one by one. Eventually, those farms can't sustain a viable business and close up shop. Then the real development kicks in and fills those fields from wall to wall. We really need to prioritize our farmland protection in areas where the soils are good and farms are still relatively intact. Another interesting finding by AFT, which many of you probably already know intuitively, there are 5 times more farmers above the age of 65 in New Hampshire than there are farmers under the age of 35. This predicts a major transfer of farmland over the next 20 to 30 years, so we're going to have to work extra hard to protect and transfer as much of that farmland as possible before it's all gone, because it will be gone at some point, except for the land that we protect now. So I'd like to shift the discussion now to talk about a project that's one of my favorites, the Bodwell Dairy Farm in Kensington, New Hampshire, a local farm that I helped self-protect over a 4-year period. I chose this project to share because it represents a typical project relying on many different levels of funding and support from the federal, state, and local agencies, as well as some private funding. So why conserve Bodwell Farm? Well, it's about 300 acres of farm and forest land. Town enjoys the scenic views, the rural character, the history of the farm, and a lot of the population uses trails that circle the farm. The farm also has quite a bit of prime, statewide, and locally important farmland soils. There's significant wildlife habitat on site. There's a source water protection area for the Exeter River that eventually supplies water to the town of Exeter. It's also in the New Hampshire Coastal Plan focus area. And finally, some of the lower lying areas of the property act to mitigate floods and attenuate pollution. Some of the primary partners on the project, obviously CELT was there to hold the conservation easement. The town of Kensington is holding an executory interest, as is LCHIP, and NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, will hold a third-party right of enforcement. We also worked with the Great Bay Resource Protection Partnership, New Hampshire Moose Plate, and several private foundations. So the question was at the beginning of the project, and this is just the northern portion of the project, did the town want to see 49 houses or farmland forever? Did they want an expense to their tax rolls, or did they want a revenue from the taxes generated from the farm? So some common questions to consider when you're working on a project like this. You need to think about what your easement language is going to sound like. What are the requirements that you're going to want placed on the farm? In many cases, a land trust will already have a model easement that you want to work from. The Natural Resources Conservation Service has required deed terms, as does LCHIP and some of our other partners. And last, the landowner may also want some reserved rights depending on the kind of operation they have or the layout of the conservation easement. You also want to talk with them about any areas that they want excluded from the easement, and it's really important to understand that before you do any type of appraisal work. Speaking of appraisals, you're going to want to know how much the landowner is hoping to achieve. That appraisal is going to analyze what the value of the conservation easement is. And if you're working with any land trust that's accredited, they're only allowed to pay up to fair market value, but they cannot go over that. So you're going to have to stay within those bounds. In some cases, the landowner may donate the conservation easement, or they may make what's called a bargain sale, where they sell for something less than full fair market value. You also definitely want to have a purchase and sales agreement where you can confirm the purchase price, determine the easement area, establish a closing date, and any other contingencies that you'd like as part of that contract. But it's really important to have that contract so you and the landowner understand what the plan is moving forward. And last but not least, all the grant funds that you may be out there searching for will have various time frames or expiration dates when those funds go away. So it's really important to try to coordinate those funds so that they're all available when the end of the project arrives. So this is a great photo. This is a group of elementary school kids that came out to the farm for a tour. It was really a blast having them there, but I was actually a little surprised to hear that some of these kids who grew up in Portsmouth had never seen a cow in real life. As you can see in the photo, I was super thankful Mr. Bodwell had turned off the electric fence that day. So a little bit about NRCS-ALE Funding. This is one of the primary partners and sources of federal funding for farmland protection in New Hampshire. In most cases, you're going to want to partner with a local land trust if you can to secure these funds, because it is quite a hefty application process that can sometimes take up to a year just to prepare the application. Projects over time can often take 2 to 3 years by the time you're done with it. The project needs to meet certain eligibility requirements. Some of the basic requirements are at least 50% of the property needs to have important farmland soils. No more than 66% of the farm can be forested. And the landowners also need to qualify for NRCS payments. It's considered an eligibility requirement and something that you'll want to work closely with the land trust or NRCS about. And I mentioned this before, but ALE requires very specific deed language that you're going to need to incorporate into the conservation easement. So it's important to know that going into the project, and it's really important that the landowner understands that as well. It's a slow, more complex project, but there's a big financial reward as NRCS contributes 50% of the total fair market value of the easement. So this is just a list of the funding partners that we used at Bodwell. Some of these partners no longer exist, but this just goes to show how many places we often have to turn to cover all our project expenses. NRCS-ALE and LCHIP are absolutely instrumental in making these big projects work, and quite often the local municipality will also be asked to contribute. This is a shot from our website, just goes to show how we also need to reach out to the larger community, asking for private gifts and donation to cover some of the last few hundred or $1,000s needed to complete a project. The big take home here is that it takes all levels, from federal to state to local, to make these projects fly, and every little bit helps. So last, I'd like to talk about how towns can help protect more farmland. And when I say towns, I also mean planners, regional planners, anyone that's not working directly at the land trust, how you can try to protect more farmland. So municipalities can play an instrumental role in bringing their farms front and center in the community. Conservation commissions can hold farmland easements, although, like I said, many are turning to their local land trusts to facilitate the project and to hold and steward the conservation easements over time. Agricultural commissions can participate in planning and zoning exercises and can act to amplify farmer concerns or ways in which the community benefits from their local farms. And finally, towns are capable of buying and owning farmland that could be leased to a farmer or used as community garden space. It's hard to believe, but during World War II, these victory gardens actually grew about 40% of the nation's vegetables. All in all, there are lots of ways municipalities can get involved in protecting and stewarding farmland, and I'd encourage everyone here to think about how you could bring forward some small effort in your own town. In doing so, here's a small list of resources to seek out for assistance. As I said, land trust should be a go-to resource, but if the community is having trouble connecting with one, you could always attempt to manage a farmland conservation project through your conservation commission or local conservation district if you have one. I've already mentioned several funding sources at the federal and state levels, and your town may also contribute funds from a conservation fund or divert a portion of all or some of the land use change tax to support farmland conservation. If that doesn't ring a bell, the land use change tax is just a tax that's applied to landowners in New Hampshire who remove their land from current use. Last, many towns turn to their town meetings or ballot boxes as a way to appropriate town funds to help conserve a farm. While the cost to conserve a farm may add a few dollars to everyone's taxes in the short run, the benefits of preserving farmland in your community are going to last forever. I've seen time and again voters approving measures that protect farms. Keep in mind that conserving a farm is not for the faint of heart and is essentially a very complicated real estate transaction It requires fundraising on multiple levels. So towns considering a go-it-alone approach should make sure they know what they're getting into. Like any real estate transaction, there's a proper sequence to follow based on the specifics of each project. And you want to be as frugal and efficient with your funding as possible. You also want to make sure you have a written binding agreement with the landowner, as I mentioned before, and you'll need to do your own due diligence like title research, potentially a survey, drafting the easement deed that needs to stand the test of time, and of course the best part, closing the transaction. There's almost always a surprise during each of these projects, so plan ahead for issues like title problems, boundary disputes, mortgage payoffs, and other really fun diversions. And perhaps more important to your long-term sanity and financial security, you'll need to devote some funding to a long-term stewardship fund so that you can afford to monitor that easement each year and spring into action if the easement is violated in any way. These issues cost money and sometimes require legal assistance, so do not underestimate the need for funds to cover this in perpetuity. That fund will act like an endowment, allowing you to address issues as they arise. Many of us may be used to a natural resource-based project like protecting a mile of river frontage or the last functional habitat for an endangered turtle. In those cases, the best scenario is to simply protect the land, leave it to its own devices, and let nature rebuild itself. Farms are very different animals. They require constant attention from the farmer, daily management of livestock, crops, bills, deliveries. Farm properties are commercial businesses, so it's important that any easement holder understand the relationship between the farmer and their working lands. Our goal as stewards of the protected land should be to ensure that the natural resources, like the soils, the water, and the woodlots, are being managed in a sustainable way so that future generations can continue to be productive and viable on that land. So looking back at the Bodwell Farm project, overall this took about 4 years to complete, and in total we conserved about 305 acres. The total project cost about $1.5 million, and all of that was fundraised. You can see the numbers here, but about $700,000 came from the federal level, that's NRCS-ALE. About $295,000 came from the state, that's L-CHIP and Moose Plate. And about $100,000 came from the local town of Kensington. We also applied and secured funding from several foundations. That was almost $350,000. And last but certainly not least was about $101,000 in private gifts received. So what's next on the horizon for conserving New Hampshire farmland? We're now starting to realize, especially on the seacoast, that simply conserving the land is only the first step in ensuring that a farm can remain a productive and viable operation over time. We're starting to see major issues in some parts of the state around affordability of farmland. And we're also rethinking the general prohibition of subdividing easements. And we're realizing that a 300-acre dairy farm may someday need to be separated into smaller farming units that could accommodate multiple farm businesses, each owned by a separate entity. Also in some parts of the state, we're finding that many of our young farmers leasing land are running into issues regarding long-term security and investment into their business. In these cases, the farmers leasing land are unable to invest in long-term fertility or perennial crops on land that's leased because their handshake lease may not guarantee it won't be taken away in the next growing season. So if you're considering leasing land to a farmer, keep in mind they'll feel more secure and will invest more time and care into that land if they know their lease is secure. We're also seeing a dramatic change in the real estate market, at least in my part of New Hampshire on the seacoast, where parcels in the 5 to 30 plus acres range are being targeted by estate buyers. In other words, productive, often already conserved farmland is being sold to buyers interested in the privacy and bucolic benefits of a country home. And that competition is driving land values far higher than farmers can afford to make their living off that land. As I mentioned before, we expect a significant transfer of land from the elder generation over the coming years, so we'll need those farms available to the younger farmers coming up. To do this, SALT is following the lead of many of other New England states and beginning to add the option to purchase at agricultural value, or the OPAV, to some of our farmland projects. Essentially, the land trust holds a permanent option to purchase that land, and prior to any sale, the seller needs to demonstrate they're selling to another farmer. If they can't find a farmer to buy the land trust can step in and purchase it, then sell directly to another farmer themselves. At the end of the day, having this option means the time, effort, and expense of protecting these farms won't be lost to the highest bidder. The farm stays productive, benefiting the community that helped to conserve it in the first place, and the farmer knows they're purchasing a farm at an agricultural value that can be sustained by the business. So that's all I have for you today. I hope I've been helpful in some way to share my experience conserving farmland in New Hampshire. With the real estate market in full gear these days, now is the time to protect our farms and support our local farmers, or they will grow houses. So thanks for tuning in, and I'm not sure how much time we'll have at this point, but I'd be happy to answer any questions if time allows.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. That was such great stuff, and I am amazed how much you were able to pack into that 20 minutes. Super well done. So there have been a tremendous amount of really great questions in the chat, and so we're gonna do our best to try to get through as many of them as we can before we have to go off into our breakout groups. But the first one I'd like to start out with Steph Morningstar to answer: how can land trusts and towns best partner with the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust, and how can we be better allies?
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. There's some simple ways that we can work together to advance land sovereignty and food sovereignty for Black, Indigenous, POC communities in the Northeast. So first would be, as far as working with a land trust, take one of our webinars. That's really a wonderful way for you to learn about the work that we're doing and a lot of the data and lived experience of people of color and farmers of color in the Northeast. So we're addressing things like land sovereignty, Indigenous consultation, cooperative land tenure. We had the Black Farmer Fund on talking about their work. We had work on cultural respect easements in one of our webinars. So we're really uplifting some innovative tools, and it's a great way to learn about our work without waiting for an email back from me, which may take a few weeks. The second would be we're going to share out a link to a survey. So if you know of any Black, Indigenous, POC farmers or folks who are interested in farming or making a life on land, this is a survey that's targeted directly to farmers of color and land stewards across the Northeast. We're just trying to do a bit of an environmental scan to assess need as we begin to acquire land. We also offer and we administer something called the reparations map. It's a peer-to-peer reparations mechanism that upholds and advances a call for reparations that was primarily at the outset regarding Bill HR 40, but now includes Black, Indigenous, POC, earth workers, and land stewards across the entire country. And that's a peer-to-peer reparations mechanism. If you have a farmer, say, who wants to donate land or transfer land or offer reparations, this is a great way to just connect with them and connect with farmers directly in your community. So you can take a look at the map and see if anybody there is in need of reparations. That is a mechanism that's for offering support only, and reparations for donations of land or financial resources or infrastructure. And finally, if you're interested in collaboration or partnership, we are open to that. We're definitely open to beginning more relationships in the beginning of 2021. So if you're looking to collaborate or partner on anything regarding Black, Indigenous, POC land stewardship in the Northeast and New Hampshire specifically, feel free to be in touch and we can talk about that. We are not right now offering technical assistance to organizations to help build your equity, inclusivity, and diversity profile. We just don't have capacity for that right now. We can direct you to some trainings, and I think Jamie's going to share into the chat the platform from Soulfire Farm that can help you with accessing some of those trainings. And then just, take a look at our social media. We're gaining quite a following. It's a big way for us to share our work. And just take a look and support and share on and help build some visibility for this work. Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Jeremy. That was a great presentation.
Thanks so much, Steph. You guys are so inspiring. I'm going to come to your webinar next. So we've got a whole bunch of questions next, and again, we'll try to get through them. The first one, I think probably most of these are for you, Jeremy, coming up next. One is from Gal, who asked about if farmland protection includes supporting current or future farmer with business planning, marketing, etc. And if so, who does that work?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, Gal, and hopefully I got to it a little bit at the end, but we're really starting to look more at the long-term viability of these farms and farmers, and particularly for some of the younger farmers coming up. They're starting out with leased land, and as they're ready to make the transition to perhaps ownership, it's a great time to infuse some knowledge and expertise into their operations, specifically from a business perspective. And there is a new grant program that was offered at the beginning of 2020 called the New Hampshire Farm Futures Fund. And that is exactly what I just described. There's about a $10,000 opportunity for the land trust to realize some grant opportunities to pay down some of the transactional costs. But then there's an equal amount up to $10,000 that's offered to the farmers they're working with to do enterprise development, business planning, working with attorneys to help set up the conservation easement so that it's farmer friendly. So there's kind of a lot going on there, and most land trusts don't start out equipped to do that, but we're all trying to learn, and there's some great examples in Vermont and Maine of that already taking place. So, New Hampshire's kind of just catching up in that regard.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. And the next one has to do with, how we make the case to existing family farms with land that is in the current use program, that conserving their land is worthwhile and economically viable for them.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting. I just finished a project, a farm project where there had been an unexpected death in the family. The patriarch had passed away tragically, and the family wasn't necessarily ready, obviously wasn't ready for that to happen. And, in hindsight, now that we have the project done, they said, it's not really about any one generation wanting to see the land conserved. I mean, everyone feels connected to, the farm they grew up on and the farm they've given their lives to. But what a conservation easement can really be useful for is those brief moments of instability that the family really doesn't see coming. And, if you had the conservation easement in place when something like that happened, then there wouldn't be the option of trying to sell off a few acres here, a few acres there. It's really a way to keep that farm intact and sustainable over the long term from a business perspective. So hopefully that addresses your question a little bit. I think, I think these families, they're so genuinely passionate about their properties and their family history. I think it's just a great way to bring them in and hopefully protect the land so that it'll be available for generations down the road.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. And we just have a couple minutes left, but this one's from Whitney Lewis asking about, what action is taken when there are violations to the easement. I know you touched on this in your presentation, but maybe you can provide a little bit more information about that.
Yeah, well, I'm certainly not a stewardship expert. We have our own director for that and a few other staff members, but essentially our land stewards are going out on the property once a year, connecting with the farmer, walking the property, and just in as many cases, it may not be a violation that was perpetrated by the farmer. It might be an abutter, for example, that's encroaching on the property. But in any case, if there's a violation of the easement, that stewardship staff member would sit down, talk with the farmer, explain, why what is happening can't continue to happen. And again, if it's something that's coming from off the property, then we work hand in hand with that farmer to try to rectify it. And I think, for the most part, farmers, if they're doing something wrong, it's usually something minor. It's usually something that they didn't even realize were against the easement rules in the first place. So it's usually pretty easy to correct that. And I think, you know, the relationship you develop over a period of years with that farmer goes a long way towards getting through an issue like that. So.
Great. And then lastly, and I'm almost hesitant to ask this one because it's pretty technical and you can pass, but the question here from Beth McGuinn is about when the primary reason for conservation is agriculture, how do you ensure that the easement meets IRS purpose requirements considering recent court decisions?
Yeah, that could definitely be a workshop unto itself.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, what I will say is for the most part, you know, I know CELT and I'm sure Five Rivers, where Beth is executive director, you know, you're really rarely doing a project that is just farm focused. These farms provide so many other benefits for their community. I mentioned before, but water supply protection, wildlife habitat. So you're usually able to, she's speaking of the purposes section in the conservation easement, you're usually able to fill that up with just the multitude of benefits that conserving that farm will provide to the community. And then you're not in the more risky situation with the IRS where you only have one purpose and it's about agriculture. So.
Great. Thanks so much, Jeremy. You rocked it. And to Steph, the both of you, we are going to transition now. I know there's a couple questions we didn't get to, but feel free to, you know, check in with us. Send us an email after if you still want that question answered. But we are going to transition now to the breakout groups. So do not leave because this is really fun. So what's going to happen is in a few moments, Megan's going to hit a button and we're going to be magically transported into a new Zoom room with probably 4 or 5 other people in that room. And you'll have a facilitator or two that will identify themselves. And they're just going to lead us in a short exercise. The real goal is just to, you know, get off of mute and get to kind of share some ideas about, you know, maybe what's one thing that you want to be working on or are working on in your community to advance farm protection. So they're just going to lead everyone in kind of a quick introduction, go around, getting you sharing some ideas with really a goal of just kind of leaving the breakout, having gotten to talk and having some idea of maybe some next step that you might take. So without further ado, Megan, I think you can send us off and we'll come back here in about 10-ish minutes or so, 12. We all made it back. Hey everyone, welcome back from your breakouts. I hope you had some fun and exciting conversations. I hope it was fun to kind of get off mute and get some ideas flowing. We have just a couple minutes before we have to close out, but we thought it'd be fun for those who were the facilitators in the group just to give kind of a quick summary report back of some of the themes that came up in your group. So I'll go first because I was in breakout group 1. We had a very intimate group. It was just me and Emily Landry. We had a really fun conversation. Emily's with the Society of Protection of New Hampshire Forests, was formerly AmeriCorps, Swan Lakes Land Trust, and so the Society does more forest protection. But yeah, Emily was just kind of, you know, interested in personally learning more about farm protection, and she's also seems like a rock star, getting involved in getting the next generation of young people in conservation motivated and activated, as well as furthering more diversity and inclusion efforts in our organization. So it was great to talk to you, Emily, and was super inspired about the great work that you're doing. So we're gonna kick it off now with breakout group 2.
Yeah, that's me.
Great.
All right, so we had a great conversation. It was myself, Krista, Craig Privet, and Beth McGuinn. And Krista started off by just talking about their work on the Connecticut River floodplain and trying to balance the restoration opportunities with some of the local sentiments of folks interested in the agriculture of that area. And something that I think was echoed across our group, they're very, Krista and others are very interested in the diversity and inclusion side of things and trying to find opportunities for those groups. Craig, like I said, echoed that same passion and desire to get into the diversity and inclusion side. Wants to figure out how land trust can have a proactive role. He mentioned that his great-grandfather was actually a sharecropper, so he has some agriculture in his blood. And Beth talked about just the nexus between land conservation and agriculture. And she's hopeful that Five Rivers can identify some of the best soils and farms within their service area to try to protect it. So that was just a snapshot of our group.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. Steph, would you like to share what came up in your group?
Sure. Yeah, so we had Anna, Whitney, and Tom. Tom's a real estate broker, and that was an interesting conversation. He has wealth of experience in this work, and he was saying that he'd like to see towns take a stance on protection of agricultural lands. And we were talking about potentially on large pieces of land that there's a lot of youth moving up to New Hampshire and buying large pieces of land, but not necessarily having the tools or resources to manage or steward that land appropriately, or the training, like business or financial training to manage that as well. So we were starting to just about share some of those resources when we got cut out, but it sounds like there's some support set out there, you know, including the extension, and then he shared something in the chat that I'm trying to find. Whitney was saying that there are no active land trusts in her county. She's the class, I believe it was Class County Conservation District. There's just a conservation district in commission. So they're looking into exploring easements and potentially either starting a land trust or at least trying to purchase easements there so that they can staunch any development that might be happening. And then Anna was sharing that she's just about a year into her position, I believe, and just starting out on her journey in this work. And so she's learning about all this. She said just like 100 and bazillion easements that are out there, and was really curious about young farmers and recently retired farmers purchasing land in that region. So how is that? It kind of started out the conversation with Tom. So it's just interesting to see sort of the shape and mix of the demographics that are moving into New Hampshire and ways that we can work together to protect land and also infuse folks coming up with the resources they need to appropriately manage it.
Great, thanks, Steph. Great conversation. And then lastly, Gal.
Hey, okay, sorry. For some reason, I thought I had another second. Was like the fastest 16 minutes of my life. It was Ingrid, Beth, and I in our group, and we had a really awesome conversation about kind of how, well, specifically Ingrid was talking about how she's kind of currently making sure to buy locally farmed products and really support her neighbors out in Chesterfield, being able to buy from the farmers markets and get syrup from their neighbor and that kind of thing, but was trying to figure out how to really start a conversation about some of the other farmland that she gets to drive by, and what the future of those farms might look like if the conversation doesn't start. So we talked a little bit about maybe going to a planning board meeting, or talking to a select board or ag commission potentially. And Beth, who is out of Concord, mentioned just trying to get the word out on a state level for providing more local agricultural movement help. So like just that she's seeing a lot of stuff going on in Vermont and Maine, and New Hampshire is just a little bit behind, and really trying to build up the resources on a state level for more funding and education to create farming opportunities, even from a young age, kind of growing our farmers here rather than trying to find people to fill those gaps after the fact. And I think an overall takeaway, kind of as we were closing things up, was to share these webinars with the people in our world so that we can all kind of be speaking the same language. I think as far as kind of where I come from in my outreach world, getting us all on the same page really helps, so that when you talk to somebody, regardless of where they are, if we're all saying the same thing, it's just a little bit more understandable, and it's not like a different language all of a sudden. So yeah, that was it.
Great, thanks, Gal. And that's a perfect segue to our quick wrap up. We know we're just at 3:30, but we've just got a few more slides for you here. So yeah, next is really just a reminder about the 3 remaining workshops in these series. So next week is the solar siting one. On the 15th is strategies and tools for making farmland available to farmers. And then on the 22nd, we have tools and resources for supporting Black, Indigenous, and farmers of color in your community. So if you haven't registered yet, if you had a good time today, if you want to learn more, please go ahead right after you sign up here and do register. We'd love to have you come back onto the next series. We also just want to give a very special thanks to today's presenters, to Adam, Steph, and Jeremy for sharing their wisdom, for being here with us today, for just being awesome humans, and for all the great work that you do in the world. Thank you so very much. And then we also just want to ask you a quick favor. I'll paste it right here in the chat. We are hoping to get your feedback in the form of a quick 5-minute survey. Just we want to know how this workshop went for you today, if there's anything we can do better, if there's any further resources that you need. It'll help us improve, help us follow up with you. So I have pasted that link. We'll also send it in an email within the next day or so, along with a resource handout with some of the resources that came up today in the call. So lastly, we just want to wrap up by saying thanks so much for being here with us today. Feel free to follow up with any of us with any questions that you have. And we hope to see you next week at the Solar Siting and Farmland Workshop. Have a great day and stay safe. Talk to you soon.
Thanks. Bye-bye.